If you recently got your first camera or you're just starting to get into photography, chances are you've probably started to hear about something called manual mode. And that's for good reason, because using your camera in manual mode gives you so much more creative control over how your photos come out when compared to just shooting in full auto. When you're in automatic mode, your camera is making all the decisions for you. And while this doesn't necessarily mean your photos are going to look bad, this is basically the same thing as just taking a picture on your iPhone, which almost defeats the whole point of having a camera in the first place. So in this video, I'm going to be explaining the three main settings that affect your photos when shooting in manual mode, which are shutter speed, aperture, and ISO. These are the three components that make up something called the exposure triangle, which for one, all affect the brightness of your photos, but also each one has its own unique quality that changes the creative look of your final image. So first, I'm going to explain how all of these settings work on their own, and then we'll look at how you can use them together to get the desired look you're going for. Let's get into it. Shutter speed is the length of time your camera sensor is exposed to light, or basically how long your camera spends taking a photo. It's measured in fractions of a second, so a 1/200 shutter speed means that the physical shutter in your camera comes up for 1/200th of a second and allows your camera sensor to capture all the light that's let in within that time frame. A fast shutter speed will freeze motion in place, giving you a really clear and crisp image. This is what you want to use if you want to stop the action in your frame. You might want to use a fast shutter speed if you're taking portraits of people who are moving and you don't want them to be blurry, or maybe you're at a sports event and you want to stop the action of someone who's moving really fast. Slow shutter speeds, on the other hand, will capture motion as it's taking place. This results in motion blur, and it can add a really cool effect to photos where you want to show some sort of movement that's happening within your frame. You'd want to use a slower shutter speed if you're trying to get one of those really cool photos of light streaks from cars going down the road, or maybe if you're taking a picture of a waterfall and you want the water to look really smooth, you can lower your shutter speed down and it'll capture the movement of that water. The other thing that shutter speed affects is the brightness of your photos, which, spoilers, that's going to be the case for all three of these settings, but we'll get more into that later. Just know that faster shutter speeds are going to be darker because your camera sensor has less time to capture light, while slower shutter speeds are going to be brighter because it gives your camera more time to capture that light. So that's how shutter speed affects the look of an image. A faster shutter speed will have less motion blur and be darker, while a slower shutter speed will have more motion blur and be brighter. The next setting we're going to be talking about is aperture. Aperture controls how much of an image is in focus, also known as the depth of field. It does this by changing the size of the opening inside your lens. Aperture is measured in something called f-stops, and this is going to sound backwards, but a low f number actually means that your aperture is large, while a high f number means that your aperture is small. This means if you're shooting at something like f2.8, your aperture is large and your depth of field will be small, resulting in a blurrier background or foreground. On the other hand, if you're shooting at something like f11, this would be considered a small aperture, meaning that your depth of field will be larger and more of your image will be in focus. Lots of photographers like to use a lower f-stop for things like portraits, where you really want to isolate your subject from the background, but for something like landscapes, you might want to use a higher f-stop so you can get everything in focus. And like I mentioned earlier, aperture also affects how bright or dark your image will be. As you start to lower your f-stop number, the little opening in your lens will get bigger and bigger, letting more light through, resulting in a brighter image. On the other hand, if you raise your f-stop number, that opening will get smaller, letting less light through, resulting in a darker image. So that's aperture. I know it's a bit confusing at first, but just remember a high aperture equals a shallower depth of field and a brighter image, and a small aperture equals a longer depth of field and a darker image. Now, the last setting you need to understand to be able to use your camera completely in manual mode is ISO. ISO, or ISO as you'll sometimes hear people call it, affects your camera sensor's sensitivity to light, effectively changing how bright or dark an image will be. ISO is the only setting in the exposure triangle that doesn't really affect the creative look of an image. It's just there to help you get the right exposure or brightness level in your photo. But this doesn't mean you should solely rely on ISO to change the brightness level of your images. This is because if you raise your ISO a lot, it'll start to introduce digital noise into your photos, making them look more grainy and less sharp. ISO is measured in numbers, typically starting at 100, which will be the least sensitive or darkest, going all the way up to 6400, 12,800, and even higher. These will result in brighter images, but also be more noisy. Typically, you want to shoot at a lower ISO rather than a higher one because it'll give you more dynamic range, greater sharpness and detail, and lower noise levels. But this doesn't just mean you should go around shooting at ISO 100 all the time. If you do any sort of low light photography, like if it's nighttime or you're indoors, you'll realize very quickly that you have to raise your ISO to even be able to see what's going on in the frame. So that's ISO. It's definitely the most straightforward of the three settings. All you have to remember is that a low ISO will be darker and a high ISO will be brighter. So now you have an idea of what shutter speed, aperture, and ISO are, but you also need to understand how we can use them together within the exposure triangle to 1, get the creative look we're going for, and 2, make sure that we're exposing properly. Because all three of these settings affect the brightness of a photo, if you change one of them, you're gonna have to compensate by raising or lowering at least one of the others. For example, let's say you're taking somebody's portrait and you want the photo to have a nice blurry background, so you raise the aperture. Well, you're gonna notice that your photo got a lot brighter, so to compensate, you're gonna have to either raise your shutter speed, letting in less light, or lower your ISO. Another example could be if you're taking a photo of someone moving really fast and you wanna stop that motion, so you raise your shutter speed, you're gonna see that your photo is a lot darker. So to adjust for this, you can either raise your aperture or ISO. Or let's say you're doing some street photography at night. You raise your aperture as high as it can go, you lower your shutter speed, but it's still too dark. Well, then you can raise your ISO, making your sensor more sensitive to light and getting you a proper exposure. Typically what I'll do when I'm shooting is focus on my shutter speed and aperture first, because these are the settings that'll affect how my photo is gonna look stylistically, and then I'll go in and adjust my ISO after just to get the proper exposure. In fact, most of the time when I'm shooting in manual mode, I'll just set my ISO to automatic, which lets the little computer inside of your camera decide whether your photo needs to be brighter or darker. And cameras nowadays are really good at getting the right exposure. Most of the time better than us even. This is because when you're looking down at the little LCD screen on your camera, or even through the viewfinder, if you're out on a sunny day, it might look really dark to you, and so you decide to raise the brightness, only to take it back home, look at it on your computer, and realize the whole thing is way overexposed. So that's why I typically just leave my ISO on auto, but if I do ever feel like I need to change it, what I'll typically do is change my exposure compensation. Exposure compensation is the little box with the plus and minus at the bottom of your screen. Typically you want to leave this value at 0 to get the proper exposure, but if you feel like your photo needs to be just a little bit brighter or darker, you can go up or down in increments of 1/3 of a stop of light to get the look you're going for. I know I didn't explain what a stop of light is here, but very briefly, it's how we measure light in photography. All you need to know for now is that increasing it makes your photos brighter and decreasing it makes them darker. There is a more technical explanation to this, but for the sake of just getting started, this will be enough. Now you have a basic understanding of how to use your camera in manual mode, but to get good at it, you're gonna have to practice. This means actually getting out and experimenting with changing the settings on your camera to see what its limits are. If you're shooting handheld and you lower your shutter speed too much, you'll start to notice that your entire image gets blurry, which at that point you'll need a tripod in order to get sharp images. If you're using some older or cheaper cameras, you might start to notice that your photos get really noisy after you raise your ISO too much. Or maybe as you're shooting, you constantly find yourself wanting to get a shallower depth of field, which in that case you might want to upgrade your lens to something that lets you shoot at a lower f-stop, something like f1.8, 1.4, or 1.2, which at that point you're basically just emptying your entire bank account for something that was supposed to just be a hobby. All of these are really only things that you're going to start to understand by getting out there and shooting though, which is probably my biggest piece of advice I can give to beginners. Get out and shoot. It'll make you improve way faster than watching YouTube videos about photography, doing research on the internet, downloading presets, or buying courses. This is also how you start to figure out what styles of photography you're into, whether it's portraits, landscapes, street, wildlife, product, macro, astro, events, whatever. So don't be afraid to get out there and fumble with your camera for a little bit to figure out how all these settings in manual mode work together to make a nice photo. It takes some time to get it down, but the goal should be for you to be able to look at a scene and not even have to think, how should I change my settings? It should almost be subconscious, like playing an instrument, because then you're able to focus on the more important things like composition, lighting, or posing. So that's it. That's how you use a camera in manual mode. I hope this video helped and maybe made you realize that it's not as complicated as you might think. If you have any questions, put them down in the comments section and I'll try to answer as many as I can. And until then, I will see you in the next one. Peace.